In this next section, we'll be working with the gases, the smoke, the dust passes, and we'll combine them, we'll color grade them, and we'll integrate them with the rest of our shot. So let's take a look first at the effects Heli Dust. So we have all, if you remember, we placed all of these elements together here. So the effects heli dust it's the dust that's kicked up by the helicopter as it enters the frame. This dust, you will notice, a bit of a strange color, and I have to explain why. The HDRI that we used for rendering this dust is not the real HDRI from the set. Obviously, we were not when Black Hawk Down was shot many years ago. So we found something that approximated range that we needed for lighting, rendering those effects passes. Or you can see there's a fair bit of blue contamination from the sky into the final result here. So we'll need to compensate for that. And the other thing is we made the choice of rendering it fairly neutral, this whitish grayish color, because that was the best way to then have the range that we needed to color correct this element to make it look like this reddish soil that we see in our plate. And we'll need to do this for pretty much every single element that is the heli dust. So we're not going to really change this one that much, but this other one here, the explosion, we'll need to grade it a little bit. And then, of course, the building dust that occurs when the pieces are hitting the building, we'll need to color correct that as well. So with that said, let's bring up all of these elements that we're going to be color grading together. Let's put them next to each other. And we will start with the heli dust as a first element that we'll be color grading, try to integrate it with the shot. Whatever we're going to be doing on the heli dust here will be applicable to everything else or almost everything else here. So we can start with this one. So let's take a look. The heli dust has, as I said, this blue cast, and the simplest way we can color correct that or suppress that is using a hue correct node. So for that, type hue correct. That's the first one here. We are about to color correct an element which has red, green, blue layer contact sheet. We'll connect that to our render here. Double click there and then show the layer names. Then we'll select this node and hit 1 to view it. RGBA, and then we have a number of additional AOVs which are pretty much empty. So they were part of our rendering setup, but we didn't really set up the render to have anything else but the base element. So that's fine. However, we also have an alpha channel with this element. So if you are going to grade any element that has an alpha channel, if you're doing any sort of color correction, the best practice is to unpremultiply the foreground by the alpha. So one way to do this manually would be to do unpremult. Then right after that, you would put the grader operation, and then you would be premultiplying the result with the alpha channel. Whatever I'm doing here in 3 nodes, we can do the same with 1 node in Nuke by activating the unpremult by switch and selecting RGBA.alpha. And in case you don't know why we're doing this, the result, the explanation is relatively simple. If you have something that is semi-transparent, well, the alpha value of that object is going to be semi-transparent. So what that means is that the foreground value, the red, green, and blue values, are always multiplied mathematically by the value of the alpha channel. So something that is, and if we really want the color correction that we're applying to anything to have to completely reach all the transparent pixels, well, we would want to unpremult the image by the alpha. So that makes it really crunchy, where the edges that are supposed to be transparent become completely opaque. Then whatever color operation that you're applying to this will be applied fully in an area where there's no transparency, and will be applied fully to an area which is half opaque. So this operation of unpremultiplying, grading the image, then premultiplying again, is handled automatically inside the node if you select the unpremult by alpha. So remember, if you are dealing with an image that has an alpha channel and you're going to color correct it, you must. If you want to avoid black edges or edges that look like they are a different color than the rest of the color correction that you're applying to the element, you will want to unpremult by alpha. Let's take a look at the values that we're dealing with here. As you can see here, 0.02, 0.04, and 0.06. In our saturation ramp here, this blue value falls between the cyan and the blue. So if we were to suppress that a little bit, We can select both of these dots on the saturation curve, and we can bring this down to about here. And the effect of that is pretty apparent now. We have the before and we have the after, back and forth. And now we've suppressed the blue sort of contamination from the HDRI. Okay, that's the first step. I'm going to go ahead and delete those notes we're used just to explain the unpremoled process. What we will want to do is to grade this image in our plate. And so our plate is further up. I'll bring this node and the other Pyro renders further up. Just bring them up like here. I'm going to simply merge this over my background here, just to get a sense of what this gray smoke looks like over the plate. So as we can see, it's not exactly what we want this color to be. It is the sand that's being kicked up by the helicopter, and we want to grade that to a warmer more reddish color. I will now add a grade node after my hue suppression, so I can call this blue suppression. Right after this, I'll add another grade node. The grade node here, same deal. I'll unpromote by alpha, but I don't really know whether this is the right level of brightness until I get this to be in the right color. So I'll go into the multiply here, and I am going to play around with the values. So maybe if I make this a little bit more red, make this a little bit more yellow by reducing the blue, I get something more or less like that. So the idea is to try to find the right value to get this to sit where we want. So we can do it with a mult. In a separate file, in a separate nuke script, I was experimenting, and I actually did it with a gain. Changing the gain values to about 0.84, 0.51 here, and 0.35 here. So that gave me a kind of a reddish, yellowish color. Of course, you can always change the brightness of it. Generally speaking, this is in the right ballpark color-wise. Let's take a look closer at what the issue is here. So if we look at where the shadowing falls, so when we rendered this, we used the proxy geo as an object that's casting a shadow into the dust to try to match what we see here in the plate. However, you'll notice that the real building, has some imperfections. It doesn't create a very straight line. Our proxy geo is a little bit more simplistic and casts a shadow that is not really lining up with the plate. So it's a very small little thing, but there are some things we can do to try to force this into the area, reshape, if you like, the cast shadow here. And we can simply do this with a grid warp. We're going to just warp the image just exactly where we want it doing. So let's open up the grid warp. We'll add a few subdivisions to this grid warp. So the way to do that, so we have a fountain pen tip. We'll just click on the plus, add a line somewhere there, and then we'll add another one somewhere right here. The next thing I want to do is, while viewing the result, I'm going to take these points, try to bring this in a little bit more to try to mimic what the plate is doing. It doesn't need to be much. So you can see this edge falls here, and our plate shadow is a little bit more pushed in. So I can just push this in a little bit more, just like that. Something like so. It lines it up a little bit. But remember, we'll also need to add the lens distortion to that later on. So we may need to revisit that and reline it up once we have the lens distortion, which is going to warp this a bit further. Nevertheless, right now, this is good enough for lining up the edges with what we have in the plate. Okay, so we have a base color here for our smoke. And what I'll try to do is take a look at the other elements that were rendered from Houdini. So I could layer these together and then apply the grading afterwards. But I'd like to keep a little bit more control over each element. So this is why I'm going to copy paste the same operation here. And then later on, I can decide whether I want to make this a little bit more yellow, more red, or maybe a little bit brighter than its brother here on the side. Okay, so this one here, we'll just put it on the side, and we'll bring in the next element, the effects explosion itself, which has maybe a different response to the HDRI. As you can see, we see a little bit of that blue, but not that much. But nevertheless, we'll tell you what we'll need to do for the explosion is maybe suppress a little bit of that blue that we have. But that's kind of about it, because this is not dust. This is not sand. This is actually an expanding gas. It's smoke, so we can keep it grayish. So if I look at the before and after, just the blue suppression would be enough. And whatever grade that we're going to be doing here, I'll just add another grade and delete the other one. And make sure, again, unpremoled by alpha. I'll just put a grade here in case I want to later on add a few changes to my base color here. So we have 3 elements now that are graded. And let's take a look at the 4th one, which is the dust that is coming from the building after it's hit by debris. So this one, we can paste again the same correction that we've had. However, again here, if I do that, I'm basically saying that the dust that's coming from the building is red. And the building itself is not that red. It's a stony color. It appears to be contaminated by the ambient sand that's over the years soiled a bit of the surface. But the building, if you were to hit it, the underlying structure is not a sand color. It is more of a maybe less red color. And if that's the case, we'll need to maybe not grade it so warm. We can add another grade node here with untrue multiplied by alpha, and we'll maybe adjust this a little bit later to make sure that we have the right level of brightness. So now that I have all these 4 elements graded, what I would like to do is to combine them, and there's a reason for combining them together like that, because remember, we will need to apply the lens distortion to all of that. And of course, I can add one lens distortion here, another one here, another one here, another one here, but that's computationally, that is more expensive, and we're doing this 4 times. So we might as well combine all these elements, apply the lens distortion to that further downstream. So I'll combine all of those elements first. So I'll select all of this here, and I'll hit M for merge. But in the merge operation here, I want you to pay attention to how I'm going to layer everything. I'm not going to simply leave it as a over. I'm going to use a slightly different variant, and there's a reason for that. Now, I would like you to take a look closer at, say, for example, this frame here where we have the dust that's created by the helicopter downdraft. You can see that it's occluded by the explosion. So if we look at the alpha channel, there is a hole in it in some areas. And the same is true for the other elements. They are all somewhat occluded by other elements. If we look at the effects explosion, right around here, 1435, this is held out by that. Now, if I was to simply merge these things together, I want you to pay attention to what happens around the alpha channel here, or inside of the alpha channel. What we end up with is, because we have something held out by another thing that's going to be layered on top of it, the areas right on the edge there, if you were to simply put A over B, you'll end up with some pixels that are semi-transparent next to other pixels that are semi-transparent. And what you may end up with, and I can demonstrate this with I'll create a constant. A constant is basically a solid color. I'll make that color something like a grayish color, and I'll put this over that. So if I look at the result here, we end up with something that looks exactly like dust over a gray background, sure. But right around the areas where things are held up next to each other, we do end up with somewhat of a tiny, sort of like pretty subtle edge in some areas of semi-transparency. And to change that, to make this a little bit more better glued together, instead of using over, I'm going to use disjoint over. And what this does internally, mathematically, and you can actually know what it does by leaving your mouse over the operation, it shows you mathematically how the different passes, the different layers are combined. And the disjoint over does an A over B, but it combines the alphas from the various elements in a different manner than what it does for the simple over. Just remove my my gray background. This was just to show you the difference. Having a disjoint over is going to get us a better roll off between the elements, between their edges. So we have everything here but the helicopter. One thing that stands out to me immediately looking at that is how black the blacks are at the bottom of the explosion here. You can see like we have some pretty dense blacks, but in the plate itself, even the darkest darks, they're not that black. Let's address the black levels. A simple way to know what's a good value is to really analyze what we see in the plate. For example, if we look at a very dark area here, if we switch this back to spot meter, it's telling us that we are 6 stops under exposed, so fairly black. But again, this is a solid object, really far away from where the direct light is hitting. Our object here is not a solid object. In fact, it scatters the light. So the shadows are unlikely to be black because it is not a solid object. However, it's going to be darker at the bottom than it is at the top. So I think we can try to overall lift the values in the image And for that, I'm just going to, when I say lift, I'm saying globally, overall across the board, we're going to up those values. I'm going to use an offset for that. And I'm going to type in some values here to try to make these blacks overall a little bit more red. So I'll try very small values like 0.013, for example, 0.014, and possibly 0.014 right there. So that kind of lifts everything overall, maybe a little bit too much. Change the values there, not make it so lifted. But the idea is that we want to make sure that darkness that we have in the explosion is closer to the plate. So we can modify this a little bit more. Here I'm going to press on Control and click on this little color wheel next to the button 4. Here I have a pop-up window that allows me to control HSV. So value is the brightness overall. We can see up and down. I can change the value of that. And then in the hue, I can decide what kind of color I want to inject overall in my image. So I'll go something a little bit warm, halfway between yellow and brown. And then this saturation here, I'm going to try to see what happens is if I push the saturation a little bit more, push the value a little bit more. So that's borderline. I don't want to lift this too much, but I definitely want to make this maybe slightly warmer. The grayness that we see on top here, it's not too bad. I'm concerned with making sure that the blacks overall are a little bit warmer. And for that, I'm going to push the reds a little bit more and reduce the blues, the blue a little bit down. And so I get something that's slightly reddish, not completely reddish. Almost like the light from the ground is kind of hitting the underside of that. And for now, this is fine. We might revisit that later as we look at the whole picture. So that's the first element here. And then there's another element. I think it was the building dust. So that what happens to the building when it gets hit. So let's take a look at this frame. I feel that maybe this element is a little bit too bright overall. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. If you remember, we had some values already dialed in for this because we copied and pasted things here. So this is the before and after. As you can see, we've integrated that a little bit into the plate. The red here, that's fine. But maybe overall, I mean, this part of the dust is exposed directly to light. You can see it's kind of out there. We can just maybe bring this down overall. So Control click here, and I'm just going to bring the value down slightly. Let's move this across. So we were at 0.84. I'm just going to bring this down. I'm going to bring it down a lot. And actually, what I'm actually changing is not the right element. I'm actually changing. Looks like I'm changing mostly the ground dust, the ground PC's dust. So that's not the one. So I'll undo that, and I will go and change the building dust, which is what I wanted to change. So double click. I can make this brighter or darker. That's the one. So I'm going to make this not so bright. I'll bring the gain down about 10%, maybe 20%, and I'll inject a little bit of color in there by going into the multiply. Maybe a value of 1.05 in red, something like 0.96 in blue. Makes it slightly yellow, slightly reddish, and slightly darker than what we had originally. So that should work. Yeah, so I think we have a good balance overall. Again, think of it as when you're doing these kinds of color corrections, do the broad strokes first, and then you go and revisit that by looking at different frames at different times in your timeline, and then you adjust accordingly. Let's now take a look at how we're going to be grading the helicopter itself into the picture, integrating all of that with the smoke and the rest of the plate. And we'll be doing a few additional things here to the helicopter using the utility pass. And we'll also be grading different AOVs in our helicopter for best effect.